Hi there, this is Scott Parker, and when I make all my videos talking about the stories I've written, I thought it also might be a good idea to tell you my story as a writer. I've always enjoyed stories, even from the earliest days, whether they were the Disney records that I received as a young child. Comic books, of course, were a massive reason that I became a writer, and old radio shows that my parents had on cassette. I love the idea of stories in your mind. Visual storytelling is very awesome. Believe me, we all know that. But there's something about being told a story and having all of those images just appear in your mind, and it was awesome. But as time went on, I began to make up my own stories. And one of the sets of characters that I first used to make up my own stories, Star Wars figures. I don't know about you, but when you bought your Star Wars figures, the first thing that you would probably do is recreate scenes from the movie. Now that was awesome, especially when you're able to make sure Han shot first, because, Greedo, he doesn't shoot first. He shoots second. Actually, does he even actually shoot? I don't think he does. Anyway, it's because Han got the drop on him. Anyway, when you have your characters, you suddenly want to create different stories. Because Han's your awesome character, and Walrus Man, and my favorite stormtrooper, which would be the AT-AT soldier, AT-AT driver, I guess you should say. I always had him against these characters. But I made up stories all during my Star Wars years, and I began to write stories as early as 6th grade. In fact, I remember writing a story about a girl I liked and I couldn't get. And I ended up writing a story in which she was the princess and I was the space pirate, and I had to rescue her from being captured by the evil bad guy whose name don't even remember anymore. But I turned that in, actually, if you can believe that. But that's one of the few stories that I still have at my parents' house somewhere, buried deep in some box. But be that as it may, stories were always a part of my life, whether I was reading them or writing them. Now, I tried to make up my own Lord of the Rings story. I even had a map complete with on graph paper, but I looked at it now and I realized, that like me, like most everybody else, we were just rewriting Lord of the Rings. So there you go. I began to write short stories in the 90s when I was in graduate school, here and there, nothing really major. But my current writing my current writing self truly began in the summer of 2005. I had a good friend of mine. He was a coworker of mine. His name was Doug. And Doug, unbeknownst to me, was an author of his own. We would talk about all the pop culture, geeky, science fiction, comic book stuff that we like. But one day he came down to my office and he asked a simple question. He said, "Hey, I'm writing a book. Would you mind reading some of my chapters and tell me what you think?" Now, without barely even thinking to myself, my response was, "Sure, no problem, as long as you read my chapters." And we agreed. We agreed that every Wednesday we were going to meet, have lunch, and deliver a fresh chapter that we had just finished writing that past week, and then return the marked up chapters from the previous week. I actually had a problem, though. That problem was I didn't have a book. In fact, I didn't even have a book started. I had an idea, and that was the idea that I ran with. The idea was, wouldn't it be interesting to have Harry Truman, as a senator, be involved in a mystery? At first, I thought it was going to be a alternate history idea. Then I began to think that it was one of those secret history things. The idea that It could have happened, and there's no piece in the story that would preempt it from actual historical events. So on July 27th, 2005, while on vacation with my family, in a comp book, I began to write what is now known as Treason at Hanford. Every Wednesday, Doug and I would exchange chapters, and we would talk about what we liked, what we didn't like, and we were both learning at the same time. That's what started me on my writing process. Following June of 2006, I pitched it to an agent at a mystery conference here in Houston, and I was accepted. She wanted 100 pages, and she liked my pitch. I was over the moon. This was just 3 years after the Da Vinci Code, so I was already in Dan Brown territory in my head. I was going to retire from being a technical writer. No problem. Yeah, well, that didn't go any farther. 6 months later, I get the word from her that she is not going to move forward with my story. It was truly devastating. It was one of my first rejections. Nevertheless, I got myself a separate agent, and for a year she did try to place my story in the big publishers in New York City. And after a year, with 0 results, we mutually called it quits. Now, unfortunately for me, between 2006 and 2013, I didn't write another book. I tried. When I wrote Treason at Hanford, I fell back on my thesis preparation. How did I write my master's thesis in college? Well, I did it in a certain way, with note cards and planning and thinking on paper before you actually write down prose. So I spent the next 6 or 7 years of my non-writing existence trying to not do what I had done to write Treason at Hanford. Because, it worked the first time, so clearly I have to change it for the second book, right? We all go through things like that, I believe. But in New Year's Day of 2013, I made a resolution that I was going to write a short story. I thought I was going to give me one short story to write. I didn't know what I was going to write, but I had an image in my mind. It was an image of a man, and he had a fedora on, and he had a trench coat, so I kind of was thinking it was a private investigator. He was at a front door of a 1940s-style bungalow home. Now, that's where my grandparents lived here in Houston, so I had an image of that kind of house. And this unnamed person knocks on the door. And instead of someone answering the door by opening it, bullets fly through the door. And my character, he's got to dive out of the way to avoid getting shot. Now that is an image to have in your head. And I said, that is going to be the story I finish, no matter what. I don't know if it's going to be a short story. I realized I hadn't written an actual novel of any length, of anything, for 6 years. So I said, I'm going to write this story, and I'm just going to finish it, period. May 1st is when I began that writing. And I have a spreadsheet in which I noted the word counts. And I can look back now and realize I didn't do a May 1st, May 2nd, May 3rd, all the way through the end. I was like May 2nd, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, skipped the 4th and 5th, and then I still was trying to get my sea legs back, my writing sea legs. But by the end of the month, I had this thing. I had this story. It was longer than a short story. It turned out to be a novella. I didn't know what that was at the time, and I knew what they were, but I'm still thinking of traditional publishing. I'm thinking this can't go anywhere. Ellery Queen's not going to publish this. Alfred Hitchcock's not going to publish this. The big publishers in New York City are not going to publish this. I didn't know what to do with this story. Now, during the non-writing phase, I actually did have a serious blog. I blogged rapidly, and I blogged a lot, and I read a whole bunch of books, and basically caught myself up in the history of mystery literature. And along the way, I made an online friend of a prolific author named James Reasoner. Now, James Reasoner, by now, he has written 400 books under various house names and pen names. So he is a prolific guy. He is a pulp writer in the modern sense. Now, he also has a publishing house called Rough Edges Press, and I had sent this story, still unnamed, to him, and I said, James, would you mind reading this thing? I don't know if it's good. I just don't even know it's good. Could you just please read it and tell me if I even am onto something? He read it. Very nice man he is. He's read a few things of mine since, but he read it, and he came back and he told me two things. Number one, the most important, he said, the story was good, and it is worth publishing. The second thing he said is the thing that turned my career as a writer around. He said, you should publish this yourself. But if you don't want to do that, give it to me, and I will publish it under Rough Edges Press. Until I received that email in 2013, I didn't even have a thought about self-publishing and as an independent. But after he said that, I began to think about it. Wheels began to turn. And a little under 2 years later, in 2015, February 18th, to be precise, Quadrant Fiction Studio became a reality, and the story called Wading into War was published. Now, since then, I have written about 17 more things, stories of various lengths, whether they be novellas, short stories, or full-length novels, not all of which are published, not all of which need to be published, if you understand my meaning, but that is where I am, and that's where I find myself now. That is how I started on this writing journey. And from here on out, it's been a blast. So that's my story about how I began writing. I would love to hear yours. Come back soon and leave comments if you like. Goodbye.